Happy holidays and welcome back to the Champions Series topic analysis for the January 2022 topic, Resolved, the United States federal government should legalize all illicit drugs. On this topic, obviously, it's a 1 month topic, unlike the previous topics, which means it's going to be much more fast paced and it's not going to last as long, which means that people are going to run more interesting arguments from the very get go. Probably people won't save arguments towards the end. We're going to split this topic analysis up into basically 5 parts. First, we're going to talk about the definitions, basically topicality of the actual topic. We'll talk about background, some strategy considerations, AF and neg arguments, and finally, we're going to look to some tournament meta and some stuff that y'all can read given the tournaments on this topic. So let's get right into it. So first, we have to look at the actual topic. A few things come into mind first when we look to the actual wording of the topic. First, illicit drugs. So it's not very clear what illicit drugs mean, but most people agree that illicit basically means illegal, and drugs are basically like any medicine, any illicit drugs that are out there, like Schedule I drugs. But there's also many definitions of this where illicit drugs can be defined as the CSA, as any hallucinogenic drugs, any drugs that have affected the body, and basically any of the drugs that are on that Schedule I list. But this is up to the debater's own interpretation of the topic, whether they want to have illicit drugs just be the Schedule I drugs, or whether it wants to be a wide variety of things. For example, stuff that are rejected by the FDA and other types of drugs out there. I think on this topic, though, the most strategic way going around is the latter, where you basically say that illicit equals illegal, and so any drugs that are deemed illegal by the government should be considered illicit. I think that's probably the best way that people can get this topic in terms of ground, where it's not too limiting, and also so that diss ads have to have some sort of specificity. You can't just read generic, topic links. And so I think that's probably the best strategy for the affirmative. I think it's the same for the negative. So I don't think we'll be having a big interpretation topic like we've had in previous topics about how the resolution is going to be enacted. I think the other big thing here is going to be the U.S. federal government. Since it says the word government and it doesn't say U.S. federal agencies or something like that, it's kind of assumed that this has to be passed through legislation. The reason why is because we've seen legislation in the past. For example, in 1971, President Nixon passed the act that criminalized many of these drugs and put the CSA list. But in order to undo that, you have to have some sort of legislation to do so. But you could also have an interesting argument where you have some sort of courts argument where you say, hey, the courts are going to deem that law unconstitutional. There's many ways you could go about it, and debaters should obviously prove probability, as this is a policy. You can't just provide a plan. So I think that's where it comes to the definitions of this topic. There isn't anything too complex. The last thing I'll say, the word is all, which means basically affirmative has to defend the entirety of every illicit drug being passed, and the negative has to just basically find one disad. So when it comes to actual strategy, any specificity by the affirmative coming up and specifying certain types of drugs, that doesn't kick out of any neg disads, because as long as the neg's like, hey, this drug is also going to be legalized, the neg's going to have offense. So there's going to be no strategies like, for example, in the past, in the Baltics topic, where you specify what type of troops there are and many neg disads don't link. That's not going to happen on this topic. Any neg disad will be able to find a link as long as they link it to some illicit drug. So let's get into the actual background of the topic. So in 1971, President Nixon, he passed the Drug Act, where basically it has a really long name, but he started the war on drugs around then, where he's like, hey, we need to go and fight these drugs. These drugs are harming American society. And so since then, the United States has basically been criminalizing drugs. And only in recent years, around the 2000s, we've been seeing, in the last decade or so, actually, we've been seeing more states legalizing drugs like weed. But we haven't seen a push for all illicit drugs. We've only been seeing major decriminalization and legalization in some states of weed. And so this leads us to the question of what is legalization versus decriminalization. A lot of states in the status quo are going towards decriminalization, and the resolution asks for legalization. So what is the difference between the two? Legalization is where you make things legal. So it'd be legal for me to possess heroin, cocaine, whatever drugs I'm going for. And decriminalization just says hey, there's no criminal penalty for holding those under a certain amount. So the difference is legalization means I can do whatever I want. Decriminalization means that, hey, there's just no criminal penalty for doing these things. So this leads us obviously to a lot of offense and to what is actually changing underneath the resolution. A few things are changing, obviously. First, it's the federal government that's doing the action. So many federals of this ads appear here. Many states appear here, like, states counter plans, but it's really just the status quo. And all these other topics, they appear coming into the idea of legalization versus decriminalization. But what gets more important is there's a lot of other drugs that are going to be legalized in the world of the affirmative. For example, the majority of drugs that are getting legalized in states like California, Colorado is like marijuana, but we don't see pushes for like heroin and all these other harmful drugs. So it leads you into a topic where there's a few things that are changing, which are the amount of drugs that are getting legalized, whether it's legalizing or decriminalizing, and who is doing the action between the states and the federal government. So that leads us into a lot of considerations onto what debaters should do on this topic, and many strategies could go around. So let's hop right into it. Let's go into the AF strategy specifically. So the majority of concern I think most debaters having on this topic is like, what if I have a lay judge? I don't want to say that we should like legalize drugs. Lay judges probably don't like drugs. And there's a lot of ways you could go around this with like rhetorical strategies. For example, just don't neglect, don't like mention legalizing drugs that heavily, like what drugs you're legalizing. You can use it more as solvency for a problem. And what does this look like? You can argue about the war on drugs, and most people understand the war on drugs is really bad. I think this is one of the major considerations for this topic, is just ending the war on drugs. Obviously, legalizing drugs is just a complete end to the war on drugs. There's no criminal penalties. You're completely allowed to do whatever you want. So you could argue the war on drugs is just really, really bad. I think this is the most stock AF argument. You're going to say the war on drugs is bad. There's numerous reasons for this, but the most common ways are obviously like the predictive policing argument. The recidivism argument comes into that. Essentially, what we see is African Americans and other minorities, they're criminalized a lot more than white Americans. It leads to like a racial disparity of how people are going to jail. And obviously, when you're in jail, it comes into a cycle of recidivism where people are more likely to repeat, and so you're just ruining the socioeconomic classes of these people. Obviously, negative has a lot of responses to these. There's a lot of obviously alt causes, and you have like the argument that policing as an institution is also like anti-black. Policing as an institution is always going to like hurt minorities, and so you don't actually have solvency there. So there's a lot of arguments related to that. But I think the second big argument related to the war on drugs category is the idea of like who's doing it the best, right? So the federal government obviously is going to be legalizing it versus the states are not. Like some states are, some states are not. What this leads to is that there's some states that are ending the war on drugs, some states that are not. So these are like some sort of like volatility, creation of black markets. For example, Colorado, they have a legalization of weed and all these other aspects. And so Texas can get really easy access to it. Like we know everyone in high school is getting access to all these like drugs. Like there's not really solvency there. So this is more like defense the affirmative can use. As long as there's some states that are legalizing a lot of these illicit drugs, they'll always come in there. I think the other big argument when it comes to the war on drugs is how the United States is doing things abroad. A really good example of this is like Mexico. So the United States basically goes to places and says like, hey, there's this war on drugs that's occurring. We have to help stop it. And so the United States goes to places like Mexico and Latin America, and they set up institutions to like help solve it. And there's a lot of like soft left critical impacts you can go here for like some sort of imperialism impact. But there's a lot of war on drugs interventions, and those have killed people in Mexico, for example, 100,000 people there. So you have a lot of impacts coming out from U.S. interventions, and there's a lot of weighing that debaters could do on that, especially like scope weighing and many other issues. Finally, I think it'd be remiss if we go with the war on drugs category without talking about cartels. So cartels are getting a lot of revenue from these illicit drugs. Like they're going to the United States, they're selling them through black markets. They can obviously hike up prices and issues like that. For example, marijuana is like 80% of these cartels' revenue. And obviously it's dangerous to go buy things that cartels are selling because cartels are not very friendly people and issues like that. So right now people are turning to cartels to make sure they can be able to get access to these drugs. But when you affirm it, you legalize it, no one's going to go to a cartel. They'll go to their legal store on the side of the market. There's now legal people who can produce marijuana. And so cartels are basically going to lose out on revenue. And there's a lot of impacts people are going to go to in the U.S., but I think debaters here should think a little smarter and go impacts outside the U.S. You should talk about cartels in Mexico and Latin America. They require a lot of this revenue coming from the United States to operate and do many of the violent actions there. Here's where I think you're going to get into a problem. And here's where I think the debate on this argument is going to happen. The affirmative is going to argue that, hey, cartels are going to decrease violence because they don't have the funds to do so. And the negative is going to argue that, hey, cartels just won't give up. They'll go to more dangerous means. So here's where that debate occurs, and I think the affirmative teams need to strategically make sure they can win that debate. For example, if you have a statistic that's like, hey, 80% of profit, at least in the short term, cartels can't do too much because they have to find ways to fund their other operations. And we'll get more into how they'll be able to do that in like the future, the next side specifically. But the affirmative has to weigh some sort of time frame argument here in a short circuit, right? If they're unable to get funds, there's a lot of international policing and other people who are going to be able to like take them out and basically diminish the impact of cartels, even in the short term. Because cartels need to have a steady source of revenue to be able to complete their actions, which means that any short-term decrease is going to be a lot worse for them. So that's the big idea on AF's war on drugs. But there's although another really big impact, which is the research and development aspect of it. A lot of people are trying to research things like opiates and opioids. And it's really hard for you to research that if you don't have access to illicit drugs. For example, there's a lot of like private researchers and also the government who could be doing research on like heroin, and that would help them understand the impact of opioids. But since it was illegal, they was not able to. It's hard for these researchers to get like licenses to do these issues, and that's one of the main reasons the opioid crisis was hurt so bad, because we were not ready to be able to go forward and like have the research to do this. Here's where like you have to do some sort of impact weighing between like the research aspect versus any neg impacts. The research obviously is going to be really good, but what is the scope of solvency of that? How long does it take to solve? So I think the affirmative here has access to a lot of good weighing as well. The research doesn't just affect the United States, it affects countries abroad. It helps their addiction problems. There's a ton of addictions in places that are not just the United States that you can get very easy access to with a form of weighing like this. I think another really easy piece of weighing here is going to be like probability. The United States, when they've done research on past, for example, there's like THC products. They're really good for like helping in types of medicine, for example, like herbal medicines. There's a lot of like, cancer, not solutions, but like treatments that require THC and other forms of cannabis. So research is also a really big aspect on AF, and I think those are the two main stock positions. Obviously, there's a myriad of issues you could go with, like the war on drugs, a myriad of impacts on that. For example, you could go with like how that's impacted like women. You could go to how that's impacted many different groups inside the United States in many different countries. But I think neg teams can boil down most of the AF arguments to like these two big aspects, and they could go to and they can like have generic blocks to them. With that said, let's hop into the neg arguments. So the neg, I think, here is facing an uphill battle in terms of literature. When it comes to most of the literature on marijuana specifically, most people are agreeing that it should be legalized. But the neg has a lot of very interesting aspects here in terms of argumentation. I think first and foremost, there's the politics argument. And people are probably saying, like, politics in PF is really hard to read. But I think this topic lends a really easy way for it. How does this work? So obviously, if you legalize all illicit drugs, that's like very anti-Republican. Republicans would hate that. Like, you can never imagine a state like Texas ever legalizing it. So there's a lot of issues that come with the politics of the United States here. I think first, federalism. It's not obviously politics, but it's an argument. It's about states' rights. So essentially, you're saying if the United States passes legalizing all illicit drugs, according to the supremacy clause, that has to apply to all states as well. And obviously, a fiat meaning that it will. This means that you're going to hurt states' rights. States' rights could be hurt. All these other issues, and you can't imagine like Republican states like Texas legalizing drugs. Obviously, there's that statistic that's like Montana and other places have been legalizing marijuana, but you won't get them to ever legalize crack cocaine or any of these like super illicit drugs. So it lends to states' rights, and there's a lot of impacts on why that matters. For example, state flexibility. Like if this happens, it could snowball to worse things. State flexibility would be killed. So many impacts off that. But even more, I think the second one is the more obvious one. Republicans would get really mad. They probably won't pass like the UBB Act, Build Back Better. They probably will have some impact on the midterms because midterms are coming up next year. There's so many impacts on politics, and this Republican backlash just can never be good for that. Weighing for both these arguments are very good, but you have to be able to explain it to a lay judge. Be like, hey, Republicans will get mad. There are other things. I think the third argument related to Republican backlash is the alt-right argument. A lot of alt-right groups are going to get very mad if the government's going in. They're getting really big and they're legalizing drugs. They're going to see this as like a move away. And there's a lot of literature about how alt-right groups will do a lot more crime in the United States related to these legalization of these drugs. And so you can find this literature and you could make the impact on that. And people probably think like, oh, alt-right, how am I going to get a big enough number? Alt-right peoples in the United States actually have a lot more, like, a lot more killings than people outside the United States have on U.S. citizens. So you have a lot of impacts on this. I think it's nearly 15,000 per year or something around that number. But there's a lot of impacts on how many people could be hurt by these people. And obviously, in a tech aspect, you can read some framing and you can have your nativism dissat coming up, and you're fine. I think another big argument is related to the types of drugs that could get legalized. And there's a lot of drugs that can be legalized that could be really harmful. For example, there are drugs that will help with human trafficking, and that drugs, like for example, roofies, those could, when they're legalized, they could be more access to a lot of people could use them. There's obviously impacts that are really bad off that, and the weighing there could also be really good for neg teens reading soft left wing, but not just that. Legalizing drugs means opioids to be legalized, and there's already an opioid addiction epidemic that's happening across the United States. Means you undo all those acts as well. I think also neg teams also have to look out for two big arguments when it comes to cartels. Cartels, they go more underground, they do worser actions, they go to like more crime because that's how they have to recoup their money. The weighing here is going to be really important for neg teams. You have to go for uniqueness, right? I think right now cartels are actually increasing crime. You argue that legalization means that cartels have been doing it. You make the correlative analysis. Uniqueness controls directionality, the link there. I think finally there's a lot of almost pseudo-critical positions that you could read on neg. For example, these are going to be rebuttal strategies, not really case strategies. I think the idea that just doing, and a lot of affirmative teams are going to argue that, hey, you have policing as an institution that's like hurting people, war on drugs. You argue that that's simply not enough. Like the state itself is inherently neoliberal. The state's inherently like anti-black, all these other things, and you argue why that means that the affirmative just gets solvency. Could also act as a turn because these institutions get even more solidified, and there's a lot of movements right now that are looking to like fight back against like the state for all these issues. And if you pass this blanket policy, like, hey, we solve, it's not really going to create real solvency. On that issue, and I think this is the final neg argument we're going to get to today, is the idea of monopolization. So we all know about big tobacco. I think there's two arguments you can present here. One, big tobacco is looking to get into marijuana. So if you legalize marijuana specifically, it allows for the United States to go through, well, not the United States, it allows for big tobacco to go through, basically get more strong, they have more control over the industry, and that means that you have more addictions to tobacco itself, which has obvious impacts on like human health and all these other issues. But I think two, you can argue big marijuana is going to be really bad because when you have like these big corporations farming marijuana, you increase the price of it. That means that one, the actual solvency, if there's any solvency of the app, it's like, hey, people need drugs, that's going to get priced down in the market. Like the exact same thing's going to occur. People are going to go back to the black market to get cheaper drugs. But I think you could also say too, the formation of big marijuana means you have another lobbying agency in the government that's like really influential. And there's a lot of interesting evidence about how that could sway the tide of like election, how that could sway the tide of different policies. And I think it could lead to a lot of weighing there in terms of the actual argument. So for the last few minutes, I want to talk about the tournaments of this topic. So obviously Blake and Strake round robin have happened. Those were fairly techy tournaments, but the rest of January isn't going to be like that. You're going to have very play-oriented cases, especially for this topic when it's just 1 month long. You don't want to have like a K, for example. You don't want to be like, oh, I can read this every round, because you don't want to burn yourself out. You don't want to have like a million cases. But what I do suggest is you have a tech case and a lay case, because on this topic, it lends itself to many techie arguments that are available. So I suggest debaters to have a tech AF, a tech neg, lay AF, lay neg. And their lay negs and AF should form one thesis, basically like, hey, the war on drugs is bad for AF, or forms the thesis of like, hey, drugs can be used for like social purposes, like R&D and all these other issues, and a thesis on neg. And the reason why is because there's many different ideas, and they can get very contradictory very quickly, especially as round progresses, right? So debaters, I think, could be very simple, and they could just come up and just read the sole contention, many different ideas underneath it. Or debaters could come up and obviously read a techie strat that has a bunch of ideas and can terminalize it. And finally, I think debaters should look into framing on this topic. There's a lot of soft left positions on both AF and neg, and there's a lot of positions that could utilize the impact framing or any like framing just generally here. And that framing would help debates become a lot more streamlined and easy for people to understand what's going on, and basically could filter out arguments, especially on this topic coming out of winter break. people are probably going to prep a lot, or people are going to have no prep because they have, they party winter break, who knows. But people are going to have a lot of prep, and the way you can filter prep, especially if you're like a small school or something like that, is read some sort of framing argument, and you could basically make sure you're linked to framing. You could just prep out links into the framing, and you should be fine. And so I think those are the strategy considerations for this topic. Coming into for like a tech aspect, looking at tournaments specifically, you have like Churchill, Sunbite, you have ASU. Those tournaments tend to be, especially when things are coming in person now. Well, I don't think anyone's in person for this topic, but some tournaments are coming more in person. You're not going to have like the huge like Nats circuit judging pool that you usually had when online. So I think my prediction is that as tournaments progress to go more in person, there's going to be a lot more flay aspect happening to the entire circuit. So you want to make sure that if you were reading, I don't know, some techie position there, you have a flay version available for it, a very very adaptable version available for all judges. But obviously the big Octus tournaments, those are still going to be online. And so you're going to have the usual judge pool, which means that you will have a bunch of flay judges, but you're also going to have some very strong Nat circuit judges that are also going to be in the pool. So that's why I suggest you to have 2 cases for this topic and be ready for anything. So that basically concludes the topic analysis for January 2022. As always, happy holidays and happy debating, and good luck in the season.